There is not only the good fairy, but the old witch. There is not only the kindly old teacher, there is the sorcerer. And there is also some way in which magical attributes are frequently imposed upon the hero or the heroine. So the fairy story differs from sober romance in the introduction of a supernatural factor. This supernatural factor usually involves the protection of some person from impending disaster. Or, if it is a negative kind of story, it subjects the individual to the tyranny of magic, of the sorcery of some other person. This sorcery must ultimately be counteracted by good sorcery. And as the magician and the sorcerer lock in their eternal struggle, we can go back to the primitive tribes of Africa. We can go back to the most aboriginal peoples of our own hemisphere, or of the South Pacific, or of Middle Asia, and we will find there human life at the mercy of the struggling powers of good and evil. Everywhere the same essential pattern holds. But in the fairy story it is essential that the power of good shall be victorious, that all shall come out well, and the hero or the heroine shall come to the final good which they desire. The struggle of magic is very interesting because it arises from one of our oldest instincts and one of the most flexible energies which we possess within our own consciousness. Paracelsus was quite true when he pointed out that the great agent of magic is imagination. Imagination is available to all of us. Imagination is a magic power within ourselves. It is the power by which we can inwardly transform values, that we can wave a wand of thought, and by so doing, and by the stimulation of the emotional power of imagination, we can create worlds, we can change patterns, and we can fashion a universe according to our heart's desire. All these things can be accomplished internally. So imagination is the ever-available agent of magic. Imagination, it makes possible to us not only this transformation within ourselves, but also, through its extension into society, many forms of progress, growth, the improvement of things. For actually, all growth, all improvement on the level of consciousness, or in the example of conscious beings, depends upon a certain internal imagery by which something desirable is first envisioned and then gradually brought to reality through art and science. So our magic factor is the power of the dream in ourselves. Primitive man knew this, and he also suddenly came to realize that imagination was more than merely a magic of internal frustration or the creation of an internal life. Imagination had something to do with facts. There was something about imagination that could change mice into horses and pumpkins into royal coaches. And that was the problem that primitive man sought to understand. And perhaps he did better with it than we have. He discovered that there is within man also a polarized magician. There is the good magician, who takes upon himself the attributes of the counselor. He is the Merlin. Merlin the magician was a grave and wise old man whose magical powers arose from his virtue, from his traditional age, from his long experience. And this good magician, Merlin, was bound to the court of the kings of Britain and became the protector of young Arthur, who was, of course, the hero self. So Merlin was one kind of a magician, representing imagination strengthened by the wisdom of the ages, gaining its authority from the deepest and most powerful of our positive ideals. Imagination then grew not merely of itself, but of experience beyond our common experience. And it is said that when reality came into existence as a material or factual thing, when men no longer believed in magic, Merlin went to sleep in a house of glass. Imagination gradually failed in man, and he lost this primitive power to change things, particularly the primitive power to change himself, and by changing himself, change everything else. So we have the magician now as opposed to the scientist. Now, a scientist is a good practical man who does perfectly wonderful things in bottles and on blackboards with very complicated groups of figures. The scientist is the new magician. He has his own kind of imagination. But he is opposed to the Merlin, the conjurer, the strange and mysterious wonder worker of the ancient fairy lore. This modern magician places his entire emphasis upon the power of the world as magic to change man. Merlin, however, believed in man, the magician, changing the world. One, the materialist or the realist, feels that man must become ultimately adjusted to his society. Imagination, however, recommends that man remember that he can always be master of society and that it can ultimately be changed to meet his requirements. So the magician, possessing this power of imagination, discovers that as he uses it, he is able to make new values appear, that he can make the dead rise, that he can make the sick well, that he can perform many services, and like the good knight-errants of long ago, he can ride forth in his silver armor, rescuing the eternal damsel in distress. This distressed damsel being, of course, his own anima, or his own soul, that is the sufferer from all the confusion of personal life. The power of imagination is not only its fantastic factor, but the fact that perhaps through imagination more than in any other way, man is able to experience truth. The things that man imagines may be more real than the products of his intellectual procedures. If he imagines beauty, he is nearer to the truth than when he rationalizes deformity. When he recognizes the power of good or the power of self over circumstance, he is nearer to the truth than when he recognizes evil and the power of circumstances over him. Yet imagination can become morbid, and under the morbid imagining, all good things can be destroyed. And the evil magician, recognized under such fabulous forms as Klingsor in the legend of Parsifal, thereby becomes the perverter, the misuser of the creative power of imagery. Negative imagination can take a world and make it all bad. Negative imagination can fill us with doubts and surround us with suspicions. Negative imagination can make everything seem to be terrible, A negative imagination can cause us to be continually the victim of evil or of conditions which perhaps have no existence apart from imagination. Yet if held in imagination long enough, will make such deformity in our own character that we will bring upon ourselves the very things that we have previously invented. Thus, negative imagination becomes a power of evil, and is the black magician, the sorcerer, the necromancer, the one who deals with the dead, and whose machinations are found in spells written upon the road or drawn upon the earth at crossroads by an old cemetery. All these things are also psychological. And today we are beginning to recognize that our own lives depend very largely upon the discrimination we use, the energy we apply, and the devout idealism with which we direct our own imaginative powers. The old Hindu classic has a term which covers the thinking rather well, namely that nothing is either good nor bad, but thinking makes it so. Therefore, thinking perhaps becomes our magician, our black magician, whereas dreaming and hoping becomes our white magician, the power which is continually striving after good, striving after the realization of that which is beautiful and true. Now, it seems to us, of course, that it would be quite impossible for us to wave a wand and cause a mango tree to grow, or cause a boy to climb up a rope and disappear in the air. Yet whether we know it or not, our own magic is far more powerful and far more immediate and far more frequently applied than in the case of these so-called illusions of conjuring. Actually, our own imagination can take a perfectly good life and wreck it. Our own imagination can take a useful situation and destroy it. Our own imagination can not only destroy our peace of mind, but destroy our sanity. It can take us and twist us into such incongruous and incredible situations that it is relatively impossible for us to extricate ourselves. And yet beneath all of this tangled confusion and disorder, there may be a comparative absence of facts. We all live in a magic world. And the power of this magic depends very largely upon what pressure we are responding to. Whether we are accepting the ancient traditional pattern of the beautiful legend, or whether we have become so indoctrinated with realistic literature that we are predisposed to believe that the unhappy ending is inevitably necessary. These things are of believing, not of the fact. And all magic is of believing. And no human being is without beliefs. And the most devout of all believers may be the unbeliever, who has come to a dynamic state of negative acceptances. These things always appear in your folklore. For man discovered long ago that there was another world, a world that is available to him through daydreams, through imagination, and through the devout integration of himself around some principle which, perhaps not obviously demonstrable, is still necessary to his own security. The individual who has lost his dream has lost all. And it is his duty to restore his dream if he wishes to restore a proper, balanced way of life. Here, then, is another element of our fairy tale. Now, in the case of Cinderella, we do have, of course, another factor that applies and appeals strongly to human nature. There is in each of us a curious sense of loneliness, of isolation. There is a tremendous frustration relating to value. Whether we wish to admit it or not, We all feel like stepchildren of the infinite at some time or other. Perhaps we are not this way continuously, but when problems arise, we nearly always visualize ourselves as victims. Therefore, in our fairy tale, we nearly always visualize our own psychic integration